For over 200 years, trains have changed our lives. They reshaped our towns and cities with literally groundbreaking engineering.
The idea of the underground, this was a completely revolutionary, visionary idea.
Inventions like the rocket powered Britain's industrial revolution and helped build an empire. They ushered in an age of leisure tourism and luxury travel that we still enjoy today.
The train allowed people to escape their everyday life.
And speed masters like the legendary Flying Scotsman even changed our diets.
Fish can be caught off the Cornwall coast and brought into London within a day.
This time, how trains moved into cities, transforming how people work.
This was the first urban electric railway anywhere in the world.
Transporting millions of people every day.
One of the terms that is used to describe rush hour is super dense crush load.
Inspiring classic creations of design.
The stations on the Moscow Metro are like nothing else in the world.
And now building a new multi-billion-pound network. These are the trains that built Britain. Today, London is home to the largest construction project in Europe, Crossrail. Digging up over 3 million tonnes of earth, creating more than 26 miles of new tunnels. It's building what will become the Elizabeth Line, a brand new addition to the London Underground. But the story of this famous transport network goes back more than 150 years, back to a time when Victoria was on the throne, London was at the height of its power, and yet the horse and carriage, or cart, still ruled the road.
The 1840s railway mania transforms London. Overnight, it's different.
London was the biggest, greatest, richest city in the world. It was the centre of what was becoming a huge empire. Economically, it was way ahead of America and most of its continental neighbours.
With businesses expanding and more jobs on offer, people flocked to the capital.
London is absolutely bursting at the seams. There simply wasn't enough space for all the people. It was big, it was smoky, it was polluted. And if you imagine there's about 50,000 horses there, all taking people and goods, and you are generally travelling through roads that are pretty thick with horse manure.
A staggering 37,000 tonnes of horse dung were dumped on these streets every year. And that's not to mention another 40,000 tonnes of dung from sheep and cows and pigs, as well as the gruesome products of the slaughterhouses chucked in as well. In those days, that was the smell of success. There wasn't really a concept of affordable transport back then, so people were wading through the slurry to get to work. Dodging carts and carriages, navigating the streets was daunting.
Sometimes I think we imagine that travel was much more genteel in the past, but actually in early Victorian London, it was every man for himself. It was a wild, fighting jostle to get to where you wanted to go.
With so many people living within walking distance of where they worked, slums became rife. Central London was at breaking point, and something needed to be done. So railway engineers were asked for a solution. All sorts of inventive ideas were put forward, from new walkways to hydraulic train systems. But only one plan was ingenious enough to gain traction. Charles Pearson, solicitor to the City of London, proposed a radical idea: to run trains under the streets.
There were lots of engineers, very eminent engineers, who said that it couldn't be built. And more to the point, people would suffocate travelling in these long tunnels as well.
Understandably, people took some convincing.
There's lots of talk that you might go into the underworld. This is an evil and scary place. And you do see a sort of subset who actually think this is against nature. Man is meant to be on the earth. He's not meant to be underground. So you see a lot of resistance.
Despite supernatural apprehensions, Pearson finally got the go-ahead to build what would become the London Underground. They broke ground in 1860 to construct the first stretch of the Metropolitan line. It ran from Paddington via mainline stations Euston and King's Cross, over to Farringdon and the financial centre of the city.
The first underground was built by a method called cut and cover. They built a trench, they put the tracks down, some reinforcing walls up, and then they covered the hole with a roof and put the road back over. The disruption was profound. The streets for 2 or 3 years became like a builder's yard.
This type of construction called for hard physical labour, and there was a particular team of men who could get the job done. Navvies, named after the navigators who built the canals a generation earlier, who mostly came from Scotland and Ireland.
The navvies had a well-earned reputation for hard living, and where the railway passed under some of the wealthy residential areas, there were lots of complaints made to the newspapers saying that outside their lovely Georgian terrace, there was all this filth and squalor and navvies swearing and cursing.
But despite the prudish objections, after 3 years of chaos, sweat and toil, the first stretch of the Metropolitan line was ready for passengers. The PR team got to work inviting notables and statesmen to test out this new age of train travel. And on the 9th of January 1863, in true Victorian style, a grand banquet of worthies was held in Farringdon Station to mark the official opening.
Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, who was really quite elderly at the time, was invited to attend the opening of the Metropolitan line, and he declined, saying, "I would like to spend whatever time I have left above ground rather than beneath it."
But despite the odd sceptic, reactions to this extraordinary achievement were hugely positive.
I think it's a real tribute to kind of human courage and ingenuity that on the first day there was 40,000 people went on it.
And frankly, in Victorian middle-class society, if you haven't been on the Underground, well, really, you're not up to date with modern developments.
News of the railway travelled fast, and people flocked from far and wide to come and use it. It's a phenomenon that continues to this day, with tourists from all over the world enjoying the challenge of navigating the Underground network. But for their Victorian counterparts back in 1863, the experience was somewhat different. When the first line opened, the electric trains we use today didn't exist.
Right from the start, the Underground was run by steam locomotives. They were special steam locomotives that were supposed to be sort of low emission, we'd call it today. They were supposed to sort of take on their own steam and not put too much smoke in the stations. But frankly, this didn't really work.
The Metropolitan trains were the first ever locomotives to be built with condensing equipment. Weighing in at 45 tonnes, with an equally hefty price tag of £2,600 each, that's over $250,000 in today's money, the first batch were given mythical names like Hercules and Apollo. But despite the engineers' best efforts, steam trains and tunnels were never a good mix.
People talked about the filth and the smoke, and there were lots of cases of people being ill and having to be taken to hospital as a result of travelling underground.
People would come out kind of gasping for air, and they'd go to the nearby chemist and say, "I need something to revive me." And they'd have this Metropolitan mixture to kind of get their breath back.
The Victorians were a lot less fussy about pollution than London commuters today. Undeterred by the conditions, plans to expand the Underground were soon underway. An Act of Parliament declared that no mainline railways were allowed into the city centre. They didn't want these modern machines driving into the heart of the traditional capital.
Think about Marylebone, Paddington, Euston, King's Cross. They all stop on the edge of the city. So how do you get customers going between them? It was decided they could create a line to connect them all up together. This was an absolutely brilliant enterprise that enabled people to travel all the way around all the major stations and more.
We know it today as the Circle Line, which looks like a wine bottle on the Underground map. But the two railway companies who built it were arch enemies, and their feud continued even once the line was opened.
The Metropolitan Railway controlled the clockwise trains, and the District Railway controlled the anti-clockwise trains. And most stations had actually two ticket offices, and they sold tickets that were not interchangeable. You had to buy the right ticket to go on the right railway, and you might be dispatched a much longer way round than might have been convenient if you happen to go to the wrong ticket office.
Today, there are still 2 underground stations at Hammersmith, all because the companies refused to share a station here. But this expansion quickly began having a much bigger effect on the city.
Wherever it went, Kensington, Putney, Wimbledon, Ealing, which had been little villages really, soon became bustling suburbs.
Thanks to the London Underground, a new city lifestyle was about to be born.
This idea of commuting in and out of London or a big city didn't really exist till this point. You lived and worked nearby.
And across the globe, a very different city was about to get a transport network that to this day is like no other. London was the first city ever to run a railway under its streets. From the outset, the expanding network began shaping how people moved around the capital.
What it really gave people was the option to travel very quickly within the working day, and it spreads to other cities and becomes very popular.
Keen entrepreneurs spotted an opportunity.
The middle class are burgeoning, expanding, they're soaring. And a lot of these people, they have spare money, and they think the best thing to do with their money is not to put it in property, but to put it in the railways.
As more underground lines were built, they began competing for passengers. The Metropolitan line had an ingenious plan to make its railway a much more lucrative enterprise.
The line breaks free and pushes on north into those open fields where no houses existed before, just northwest of London.
The railway company bought up land outside London in order to extend the Metropolitan line. And once the railway was built, any remaining land was then used to build whole new housing estates.
Now, this is brilliant because this means they can quite simply build houses around new stations and create traffic for the railway they're actually building. It becomes known as Metroland because it's an area around the Metropolitan line. It really was kind of the template, the blueprint for all suburbs since.
Metroland became somewhere for people to aspire to live. Guidebooks were produced advertising it. And it was immortalised by the classic 1973 TV documentary. Here we see John Betjeman recounting his own personal memories of how it was promoted and what the scheme set out to achieve.
When I was a boy, live in Metroland was the slogan. It meant getting into the country, for the line had ambitions of linking Manchester to Paris and dropping in at London on the way.
These plans seem ambitious even for today, and although the railway never got quite that far, it did succeed in creating a whole new countryside community. Compared to today, travel on this line was luxurious.
For a while, Metroland was passed through by 2 wonderful restaurant carriages, which served breakfast on the way into town in the morning for those people working in the banks, and every evening would serve you dinner on the way out.
This idea of the suburban life was suddenly within reach for the average working man and his family.
You have this marvellous visionary dream. You can work in London, but you can commute in by train every day, and your family can have this wonderful country life.
The Underground was responsible for a brand new mode of living, introducing the daily commute to and from work. It was a great advance, though as a long-term commuter, I can't say it's always felt that way. Still, it gave British people something new to talk about. Trains running on time? Was it crowded? Good journey?
You must remember that this idea of commuting in and out of London or a big city didn't really exist till this point. You lived and worked nearby.
The idea that we have now that a lot of us want to live in a house near a railway station, that starts then.
This commuter lifestyle, which began in London, has now become the norm for many people all over the world today. And nowhere in the world has been transformed because of it quite so much as Mumbai. The Mumbai Suburban Railway is one of the busiest commuter train systems in the world, currently transporting more than 7.5 million people a day.
They've developed the most fantastic network of suburban railway lines, which carries literally millions of people into the city centre every day.
For somebody from Britain who may think they've travelled in extreme conditions on the London Underground today, really, there's no comparison.
The trains have open doorways, and that's one of those signature images that you always see on TV of people hanging from the doorways, clutching at windows, flip-flops falling off outside the doors. It's just a world of its own, and in fact, I was warned by people not to board the railways.
Me too. But if you are brave enough to squeeze onto one of these trains, you get the chance to see a whole different side to the city.
They crawl through the backs of people's houses. You can see what people are having for breakfast. You can smell what they're cooking for dinner. You can see what they're reading in their newspapers. And it's just the most fantastic way to travel through a city.
But way back before the railway was built, Mumbai, or Bombay as it was back in the 1850s, was impossible to navigate.
Before the arrival of the railways, transport was appalling, even worse than in Europe. The main way of getting round was the bullock cart, which averaged all of 2 miles per hour.
India was then incorporated into the British Empire. In order to access more goods and keep control over the country, Britain decided to build a railway. Running from north to south Bombay, it was the first railway, not just in India, but in the whole of Asia. Around 10,000 people were employed to build the first stretch, which opened the same year as the Metropolitan Railway in London. That first historic line grew into what is today the Mumbai Suburban Railway.
It was an extraordinary thing to have built because it emerged bit by bit in little pieces adding together.
Local residents were in awe of the first railway. It was reported that they bowed to the omnipotence of the steam engine as it passed. Some saw it as a god, placing food on the footplate and flowers on the tracks.
India has a very close relationship with its railways because the roads remain very bad even today.
The trains are lovingly known as the locals by residents in Mumbai, largely because they are such a significant part of the city and it's the only way they can get round.
The railway is vital to so many that as a result, it has the most severe overcrowding of any rail system in the world.
One of the terms that is used to describe rush hour on the Mumbai locals is super dense crush load, which is a period of the evening when more than 6,000 people can get onto a train that has a capacity for 2,000.
Just this huge sort of cattle pen crowd of humans that just push and shove to get on the trains, and there's people on the roof. So it's quite alarming. Do they fall off? Tragically, yes, they do, and that number of deaths is really high every year. So it's a kind of remarkable system, but as an individual human, it's terrifying.
The Mumbai Railway is one of the most dangerous in the world, with almost 3,000 fatalities each year. But with so many people dependent on it, the railway continues to be in huge demand. Despite appearances, the railway itself is a miracle of efficiency. Even during the monsoon season, 97% of its services are on time. It's difficult to imagine, isn't it? The suburban railway has utterly transformed Mumbai.
It's the lifeblood of the city. It's incredibly important in terms of the way that Mumbai developed into one of the biggest cities of the world.
If you went to Mumbai not so many years ago, it was quite a low-lying city, very dense. Today, it seems like a matter of seconds, but really in a quarter of a century, the city's centre shot up. Skyscrapers everywhere. Mumbai without its railways wouldn't be Mumbai. It simply wouldn't.
Mumbai would grind to a halt without its underground, as would London without the tube. Back in 1900, nearly 40 years after the first underground had been built here, beneath Euston Road, London's population had doubled. The trains were crammed and overflowing with Londoners and tourists alike. Success had brought its own problems. And with more people living south of the Thames, engineers began looking at how to transport them across the river.
When the first underground network was constructed, the Metropolitan line, it was not a deep system. Once there was a demand for extending the underground system, we were looking at making much deeper tunnels under London. And what that meant was the old sort of cut and cover systems that had been used to construct tunnels were not going to be quite enough.
To create a line that ran under the Thames, a whole new tunnelling method was needed.
The way the line was built was actually very clever. It used a system called the Greathead Shield, and this was pioneered by James Henry Greathead.
Greathead took inspiration from a technique originally developed by Mark and his son Isambard Kingdom Brunel. His so-called shield worked like a giant cookie cutter. The men stood inside the cylinder and dug the soil out through the middle. The shield was then pushed forward by hydraulic screws.
As the men tunnelled forward, they were able to place around them and below them these big cast iron sections, which are still in use today on the tube network and gave rise to this name, the tube. And so literally they were building the tube around them, around their heads, and it protected the men as they pushed forward each time, which was an absolute innovation.
The first section of tunnel opened in 1890 and ran from a station called King William Street, near Bank, under the Thames to Stockwell. Initially called the City and South London Railway, it eventually became part of the current Northern Line.
What is really magical about the Northern Line is that you can go from north to south or from south to north, and previous to that, it was really very hard to cross the river.
This was the first deep tube tunnel in the world. My father was a civil engineer who specialised in building tunnels, including ones underwater. His hero was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and as a child I visited a lot of construction sites that were the successors to this early and famous one. But as any engineer will tell you, building the tunnel is only half the story. They'd finished the tube, as everybody called it. Now they had to work out how to get trains through it.
Up on the subsurface lines, you can have steam trains because actually it's quite close to the surface and you can have exhaust and vents alongside. When you're 10 metres below ground, that's a bit trickier to get the exhaust out. Now you have to have, effectively, exhaustless trains.
So the railway company needed another solution.
The Northern Line, or the City and South London Line, started off in concept as a cable-hauled line. Well, before construction began, the contractor went bust. So they looked for an alternative supply.
Engineers took a gamble on an exciting new source of power, swapping coal for electricity.
So how are you going to get that down there? We have to put in power stations and all the kind of the third rail stuff. And you end up with these little engines, very small engines, hauling little carriages up and down the line.
Small, but hugely powerful, these trains were a technological breakthrough.
This was the first urban electric railway. It really was the first proper electric line anywhere in the world.
Britain was a pioneer in terms of building the railways and building tube railways. You know, they were all world firsts.
There's no question about it. The train has been one of those revolutions like printing and the internet that has totally changed the way we live.
It really seemed to the Victorians that there was absolutely nothing that they couldn't do.
The Underground, the oldest and still the greatest metropolitan railway in the world.
London invented the Underground Railway, but soon some of the biggest cities in the world would try and steal the limelight by creating their own unique equivalents. By 1900, the London Underground had already been running for 4 decades.
Its success had been trumpeted on a global scale. Since construction had begun in 1860, cities around the world had followed suit. Boston in 1897, Paris in 1900, and Berlin in 1902. And finally, one of the most famous in the world to this day, the New York subway. The turn of the century saw America as a focus of exciting modernity. Theodore Roosevelt was president, telephones were in wide use, and the Wright brothers were creating their first flying machine. By 1900, New York was teeming with people.
New York at the turn of the century was really incredibly congested and also very fragmented. It was impossible to a large degree to get around. And Harper's Magazine, this very influential magazine, said, in New York, a lady, not infrequently, is compelled to wait half an hour to cross the road.
In a bid to cut this congestion, New York City built a railway. But rather than running it underground, this one was elevated high above the streets.
They thought we can run these railways without digging up the city streets on the ground at kind of first or second floor level. They were steam driven, so people would have kind of smoke kind of pouring in their windows. They were very noisy and they were quite unpopular.
Tiny steam engines hauled the cars, showering red-hot coals on the pedestrians, belching smoke on the housewives' wash. The route was past miles of tenements, giving the passengers a glimpse into every window. All the tenement dwellers got in return was a feeling of being close to the passing parade.
The elevated railway, or L as it was known, couldn't meet the demands of the growing city. And after the Great Blizzard of 1888, which crippled the entire city, it was decided a more practical transport system was needed. Locals, the likes of William Steinway, he of Steinway Pianos, had been campaigning for an underground railway. But building it was not going to be easy.
The problem there is that New York, Manhattan sits on rock, and therefore building it was much more difficult. They had to kind of blow out the rock. Building deep tubes was absolutely impossible, so the railway is just below the surface.
In 1904, the first line of the New York subway opened, running from City Hall in Lower Manhattan to Broadway in Harlem. It was to be one of the most important events in the city's history.
Almost overnight, New York has changed. No more congestion, and also the old fragmented style is all gone. People can move between it. They can move from the Bronx to Queens. They can move around the center. And suddenly New York as a city becomes unified. It becomes a real, true place with an identity.
Once the subway comes along, it brings New York together, allows it to expand much more rapidly, and it gets these huge skyscrapers, really the world's first kind of central business district. So, New York's very skyline is a result of the way that the subway can bring so many people into the city centre.
New York has more stations than any other metro system in the world. The subway not only transformed Wall Street into a global centre of finance, it made Coney Island an amusement park for the masses.
Manhattan wouldn't be the bustling, famous entertainment place, business district without the subway, which created that amazing kind of central area, Times Square and the like. As with London, as with other big cities, the Underground Railway is now an absolutely integral part of New York, and one can't imagine New York without its subway.
Plans are currently underway to upgrade the subway after decades of decline and neglect. The dreary stations have scarcely changed in nearly 80 years. They're a world away from a network across the globe that set out to rival all that had gone before. Exploiting the most up-to-date engineering, the Soviet Union designed a system hoping to outshine New York and everywhere else: the Moscow Metro. In the early 1930s, Russia was in the grip of Stalin's dictatorship, and he was determined that the Moscow Metro should glorify socialism and the Soviet state.
Stalin was very keen for it to seem so progressive, exciting, glamorous, because at the very same time, the Western capitalist decadent economies were in deep recession. But they didn't necessarily have the skills to build an underground metro deep down under Moscow's streets.
Soviet engineers were sent here to the London Underground to gather information about how this great capitalist feat could be replicated by the communists.
The Underground had just unveiled a lavishly redesigned Piccadilly Circus station, costing £500,000. It was a sea of marble and bronze, an expressly modern and stylish space. The Russians wrote that it was the best station in London, built deep in the ground, and it has escalators rather than elevators. The man responsible for this enviable feat was a chief executive of London Transport, Frank Pick.
Pick was a kind of genius, and the Russians were aware of it. So they were right up to date. And they came to the offices at 55 Broadway in Westminster, and they met Frank Pick and his chairman, Lord Ashfield, and they said, "We want the finest metro system in the world, and I'm sure you can help us do it."
In his lifetime, Frank Pick changed the look of London, not only designing some of the best-loved and classic underground stations, but also commissioning design icons like this roundel with its distinctive typeface, which is called Johnston.
So for Moscow, he was the ideal consultant. Pick and a team of British experts got to work drawing up proposals. Electrical engineers were even flown over to help with the construction. But their presence caused something of a stir.
They spent more time in Moscow setting the whole thing up electrically. And because it meant they travelled all the way around underground in Moscow, they were watched the whole time, and it was thought they knew too much and that they were spies. And actually, pretty scary. They were put on a show trial, and I don't think they'd have sentenced them to death, but it was close. So it was a pretty frightening place to work.
Fortunately, they were cleared of spying, and everyone returned home. The suspicious Russians did eventually recognise the British contribution, especially that of Frank Pick, who was awarded an honorary badge of merit.
The only award he took in his life. I think it meant a lot to him.
The result of this Anglo-Soviet effort was striking.
Moscow has now emulated New York, Paris, London, and has constructed its first tube, largely with the aid of British engineers. Here's one of the first trains to run. There doesn't seem to be much excitement, and the passengers take their seats as if they've been used to travelling this way all their lives.
The stations on the Moscow Metro, especially the early ones, are like nothing else in the world.
If you compare it with something like the London Underground or the New York subway, where you just go from A to B in quite grimy sort of enclosure, when you get on a metro in Moscow, you're surrounded by beautiful statues. These stations have amazing names, and they've got lovely music playing through all the speakers.
Some of the most spectacular stations are on the Koltsevaya, or Circle Line of the Metro.
I have a favourite station. In fact, it's quite a few people's favourite. It's called Mayakovskaya. You enter this beautiful triple-vaulted avenue of columns, and as you look down the platforms, above you are these gentle saucer domes, each lit up by numerous clever little lights that point up into mosaics which are all about aircraft and flight. And isn't it lovely? You're looking up at flight whilst you're deep down underground. It's the Soviet Union encapsulated in these glorious stations.
With extreme irony, within a few years of opening, the Metro became a safe haven for the residents of Moscow from enemy aircraft above, as Nazi bombs tore through the city.
It was the same here in London, where thousands sought refuge every night from the aerial bombardment of the Blitz.
Special trains delivered 2,400 gallons of tea and cocoa every night.
In spite of bombs and fire and death, the British spirit was stronger than ever.
Before the onslaught of war began, the Underground had taken special measures to keep its passengers safe from enemy action.
ARP in the London tube. Electrical control is a feature of the safety measures to prevent flooding in the tube. When the alarm is given, all they need to do is to press a button, a warning to close the floodgates, which indicates that all trains must be stopped once they're out from under the Thames. The scheme has cost £1 million to complete. These steel gates, over a foot thick, can withstand a force of more than 800 tons.
In the words of the Times newspaper, the Underground kept London alive. The network remains a lifeline to millions to this day. and it continues to expand. The latest edition is now reaching, possibly, the final phase. Since the first ever underground railway opened in London, trains have transformed cities worldwide, and millions of passengers depend on them.
But the London Underground is now, in normal circumstances, struggling to cope. More than 5 million passengers are crammed onto its trains every day.
London Underground, as we know, is currently operating at a far higher volume of people than it was ever intended to do. It is vastly over capacity. There are often times we have to shut the platforms down because the whole place is just running so busily.
Over 150 years ago, the Metropolitan line was the answer to London's problems. Now, the burden has passed to Crossrail. For the first time in over 40 years, the Underground is getting a brand new line that will expand the network even further.
London set the tone. It was the world's first underground railway network. Now building a brand new system to go even further beneath it. But to carry on growing, London must have infrastructure that it developed so long ago in a much bigger and newer form.
Since 2009, thousands of engineers and construction workers have been tunnelling under some of London's most historic buildings as part of the Crossrail project.
It will increase the capacity of London Underground by about 10% in one fell swoop, so it's pretty major.
One of the brand new stations being built is here at Farringdon. It's just a stone's throw away from the original Farringdon terminus of the Metropolitan line of 1863. Squeezing a whole new station into central London is not easy.
Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, the long-awaited railway that never seems quite open, is actually a very impressive engineering achievement.
It's really, really difficult to undertake work of this scale on what is really a postage stamp site when you're building. This ceiling over my head is 350 tonnes of suspended concrete, and just getting pieces of this size into London is a major feat.
The striking diamond-shaped ceiling, a tribute to the nearby Hatton Garden Jewellery Quarter, was craned into the site in sections. After that, a giant steel framework was built up and over it. The ceiling was then bolted and braced to the framework, and the supporting beams taken away from underneath.
And there you can see the glory of it hanging just above our heads. It's absolutely 100% safe. Otherwise I wouldn't be standing here.
10 new stations are being built across London. And here are the boring statistics. There are 5 new sets of tunnels that were carved out by 8 tunnel boring machines, each one measuring 150 metres in length. They are vast.
Tunnellers are a superstitious lot, so there's a patron saint of tunnelling, St Barbara, and they have a little statue of her on the way into the tunnels.
The tunnelling machines are all named after pioneering women, including Phyllis Pearsall, who created the London A to Z, and Ada Lovelace, the world's first computer programmer. These 2 machines finished their journey here at Farringdon.
Rather than recover them, it was much easier to steer them off into the ground. So round about the end of the platform, just off to the right, is Phyllis and Ada just sitting there for the rest of their lives. It's a fitting end. I think they deserve to have their pride of place on the Underground.
These sophisticated creations with their vast rotating teeth are essentially just modern versions of the early digging devices.
In principle, where they're tunnelling now is pretty much the same as the Victorians did it, in those early tube lines. They used, great head shields and men with pickaxes before. Now we've got tunnel boring machines, but essentially it's the same thing.
But sometimes those early achievements made by the pioneering Victorians can also be a headache for the engineers following in their footsteps today.
Tottenham Court Road, for instance, had to actually slot the Crossrail tunnel in between the Northern Line and the Central Line. It was something like 100 or 200 millimetres between the Crossrail line and one of the operating lines, which still had trains running through at that time.
When it came to tunnelling under buildings like the Barbican, where music concerts take place, Engineers installed a special floating train track.
Basically, it's just some massive, great big concrete slabs which are then jacked up onto very big springs. These springs are about sort of that big. So let's say it's 8 o'clock at night and you're halfway through your Brahms concert. You can't hear the trains going underneath, so any vibration gets absorbed by the springs, doesn't get transmitted into the ground and up to the console.
Preparations are currently underway for whenever the new line opens.
One of our Class 345 trains has just pulled into Farringdon Station as part of its dynamic testing, checking the speeds and the line, and all the signalling systems are working. It is always an excitement to see a train coming into Farringdon. It doesn't happen very often, so it's always a little thrill of excitement runs through my body.
The platform at Farringdon is 250 metres long, 50 metres longer than the actual trains. This means that more carriages can be added if passenger numbers increase.
So when you get on the train, it's a good idea to make sure that you know what end you're getting off, otherwise you'll have quite a walk.
When the Elizabeth line does open, up to 200 million passengers could ride on it every year.
Crossrail is vital to London's survival as a multinational centre of growth, because what is so important to London is the movement of people within it, in and out and across.
History has told us that as soon as you open a successful railway, everybody wants to go on it. And I think it's not going to be the last railway that gets built in London.
We'll need more lines. There'll be a Crossrail 2, and why not 3, 4, 5? Where does it stop?
Rail enthusiasts, and they really are enthusiastic, point out that nearly every major city in the world now has a railway network, with more being built every day.
The railways have revolutionised our lives, whether it is where we live, where we work, or what we eat. All these were greatly affected by the invention of the railways. We should never forget that.
The functional train has also captured people's imaginations. Locals, tourists, artists, dictators.
Once the idea of subterranean networks get established, they were copied all over the world in major cities, and now it is one of the key ways that we get around those cities today.
The story began in London with trains steaming under the streets and into the suburbs. And then the transport revolution went global, altering skylines, changing people's lives, and still continuing into the 21st century.
This is an invention that might have come from 1863, but today is incredibly relevant and indeed enjoying a fantastic renaissance.
By 2050, if things develop as predicted, 75% of the global population will live in or around cities. And trains will be vital to how these major centres grow and function. And they will continue to define how millions of us live and work in that future.
And Ian's back with more trains that change the
London is home to the largest construction project in Europe, Crossrail, digging up over 3 million tonnes of earth, creating more than 26 miles of new tunnels. It's building what will become the Elizabeth Line, a brand new addition to the London Underground.
But the story of this famous transport network goes back more than 150 years, back to a time when Victoria was on the throne, London was at the height of its power, and yet the horse and carriage, or cart, still ruled the road.
The 1840s railway mania transforms London. Overnight, it's different.
London was the biggest, greatest, richest city in the world. It was the centre of what was becoming a huge empire. Economically, it was way ahead of America and most of its continental neighbours.
With businesses expanding and more jobs on offer, people flocked to the capital.
London is absolutely bursting at the seams. There simply wasn't enough space for all the people. It was big, it was smoky, it was polluted. And if you imagine there's about 50,000 horses there, all taking people and goods, and you are generally travelling through roads that are pretty thick with horse manure.
A staggering 37,000 tonnes of horse dung were dumped on these streets every year. And that's not to mention another 40,000 tonnes of